In this chapter, we will be covering anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorders. It's worth noting that until the publication of DSM-5 in 2013, obsessive-compulsive disorder was considered an anxiety disorder. It now has its own category and several other disorders that appear to be related to obsessive-compulsive disorder. Although we tend to think of fear and anxiety as the same thing, but just different levels of intensity, they clearly are not. We're going to be talking about several anxiety disorders in this chapter, and we're also going to be talking about obsessive-compulsive disorder and related disorders at the end of the chapter. So what is the difference between fear and anxiety? They feel like they're the same thing, and part of the reason they may feel that way is that they share a biological component generated by a neurological response called negative affectivity. Negative affectivity is simply an uncomfortable feeling, and both anxiety and fear feel very uncomfortable. They are aversive. We don't want to experience them. Fear is intense and immediate, and usually with a direct focus about what's going on. It's triggered by the sympathetic nervous system, but also triggered in the brain stem by something called the locus coeruleus. We'll talk more about that when we get to panic disorder. Anxiety tends to be more future-oriented. It's more cognitive in nature. We are anxious about something that might happen, but typically is not in front of us in the moment. So we might call that apprehension rather than fear. There are a variety of symptoms that are experienced by both, but they're both physiological responses that are preparation to react. As you will see in this chapter, there are many types of anxiety disorders. They all include anxiety, but how that anxiety plays out can be very different. In panic attacks, which will be our first topic, there's a fear response, that is the panic itself, and an anxiety response that is essentially apprehension about having more panic attacks. There are also significant differences between men and women in the rate of these disorders. So let's start with panic disorder and a related condition called agoraphobia, which is essentially a fear of going out for fear that you might have a panic attack, lose control, and not be able to escape from the situation. A panic attack is an abrupt onset of fear when there's no reason to be afraid. It's a false alarm. Just like your smoke detector sometimes goes off when there's no fire, any system that is supposed to go off under certain circumstances will sometimes make a mistake. In our case, the system in the brain called the locus coeruleus occasionally goes off when there is no life or death situation. By the way, we call that response the fight or flight response, although a better name would be flight or fight, because our first instinct when faced with a life or death situation is to get out of that situation. And only if we can't escape do we try to fight to the death. You perhaps have learned that it's not a good idea to corner an animal. Even a relatively safe animal can become quite vicious if he or she thinks that they're in danger of dying. The symptoms that you experience essentially are either the reactions of your body to run like hell to get out of that danger, or your interpretation of those symptoms. So you feel your heart pounding, and it is in fact pounding. because it's moving blood to your body so you can run faster and longer. You feel chest pains because your entire body is tense, and you may have difficulty breathing because of the tightness, especially in your chest muscles. The idea that you're going crazy or you might be dying is a result of looking at those symptoms and wondering what's going on. You know you're terrified, but there's no reason to be terrified. And as a consequence, you think you're going crazy. And your heart is going 90 miles an hour for no reason at all, so you think you're having a heart attack. Now, a very important distinction here is between cued and uncued panic attacks. Cued panic attacks are this fight or flight syndrome, this reaction of the body to prepare yourself to get out of a life-threatening situation. They tend to be uncomfortable, but they usually do not result in panic disorder. We know why we're afraid. We can point to it, and we don't see it as an unreasonable response. We certainly don't see ourselves as going crazy. In fact, we see ourselves as responding appropriately to a dangerous situation. It's the uncued panic attacks, the ones that seem to come out of nowhere, that are most terrifying and lead to panic disorder. The graph you see here is a classic. It is the very first time that a panic attack was measured while it was occurring in the laboratory. In this case, they were measuring heart rate, the tension in the face, and the body temperature. You can see where the panic attack occurred. And interestingly enough, it occurred during a period when the individual was relaxing. The idea at the time was that since panic is this fear response, if you could teach people to relax, they would be less likely to panic. It turns out relaxation in someone who's panic prone often makes the person feel out of control and can trigger a panic. And notice what happens. In almost no time at all, the heart rate all but doubles. And the muscle tension dramatically increases, several-fold. And even the body temperature, which takes a little while to respond, increases. Why is the body temperature increasing? The muscle tension is creating work. Just like when you go running, you experience warmth in your muscles because of the work that the muscles are doing. Panic disorder is not defined by just having a panic attack. In fact, panic attacks are not that rare. Many of you probably had a panic attack. And when you have, you recognize that it was very uncomfortable and seemed to come out of the blue, but you probably were able to attribute it to something else. You might have said to yourself, "Ooh, I shouldn't have had that third cup of coffee," or "Wow, I must really be stressed out here." Panic disorder is not just having panic attacks, but having them on a regular basis, and more importantly, fearing that you will have more of them, being anxious about having other panic attacks. They can be triggered by things in the environment, but they can also be triggered by sensations in one's own body. We'll talk about those later. Those are called interoceptive. And there are a variety of treatments that we'll talk about at the end of this section. We know quite a bit about the biology of panic attacks. We know, for example, that not everyone is equally at risk for a panic attack. Genes seem to influence risk for that. And it doesn't appear there's any single gene, but rather a combination of genes, what we call polygenic influences. We know quite a bit about the brain circuitry for a panic attack, largely because that's pretty primitive brain circuitry. It exists in rats and cats and dogs and virtually every other species with any reasonably developed brain. And so we've been able to study it in animals as well as human beings. It also involves midbrain structures. Midbrain structures are normally where we experience the anxiety that is secondary to panic. Remember, panic disorder is defined not just by having panic attacks, but by being anxious about having more panic attacks. Panic attacks increase this anxiety, sometimes dramatically in certain individuals, to the point that you develop a panic disorder. And the high level of anxiety makes panic attacks more likely to occur, so it becomes a vicious cycle. Now, it isn't just biological factors that increases risk for panic and panic disorder. There are several behavioral influences, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling. Classical conditioning, you may remember, occurs when a stimulus that produces a response, call it an unconditioned stimulus that produces an unconditioned response, is paired with a neutral stimulus. And what happens is that neutral stimulus becomes conditioned so that it creates a response, typically the same as the unconditioned response, but now we call it a conditioned response because it's conditioned to a previously neutral stimulus. What's going on in panic disorder? You have a very powerful stimulus, this panic attack, coming out of nowhere, and we're terrified. And it's being triggered, or apparently triggered, by things in the environment, except we can't see what they are. So we start to be afraid of the things in the environment that are there when we have the panic attack. Now, when we're anxious about things, we want to get out of the situation. When we're fearful, we really want to get out of the situation. We want to flee. So if you have a panic attack and you have this secondary anxiety about having other panic attacks, especially in the situations where the earlier panic attacks occurred, you're going to start avoiding those situations. That avoidance is called agoraphobia, and often it's more difficult to treat than the panic disorder itself. But finally, we can learn anxiety responses from watching other people, and that's called modeling. We know that panic disorders runs in families, and part of that is clearly genetic, but part of it also is seeing how other family members who've experienced the panic respond. Agoraphobia is an avoidance response. It's being driven by the fear of having additional panic attacks. So the individual avoids those situations, and what happens in time is increasingly they avoid more and more situations. In extreme situations, they may not leave their house for fear that they might have a panic attack. I've specialized for many years in treating anxiety disorders and started an anxiety disorders clinic when I taught at the University at Buffalo. In many cases, I treated people with panic disorder who hadn't left their house, sometimes for years. And needless to say, I had to treat them starting in their house because they couldn't make it to my office. There are a variety of factors that contribute to agoraphobia, but the one problem with agoraphobia is if you don't challenge it, it means you're not going to challenge the panic and the anxiety. And the only way to reduce any anxiety is by facing it down. We call that exposure. The symptoms of panic disorder and agoraphobia can be extreme, and often that gives you the impression that this would be extremely difficult to treat. But in fact, panic disorder and agoraphobia is treatable. Usually we use a behavioral or cognitive behavioral treatment that involves a lot of exposure. If the person is uncomfortable even leaving their home, we teach them how to manage their anxiety, but then we walk out the front door and walk a little ways down the street, and gradually each time a little further and a little further. We start walking around the block, and once you get halfway around the block, it's a shorter distance to go the rest of the way. So we kind of get a bump in that situation. If they're afraid to go in an elevator, we go in an elevator. If they're afraid to go over a bridge, we go over bridges. We can do some of that exposure with computers in virtual reality. As you probably are aware, the computers can make something feel very real without having to go for a long drive to get to whatever it is that you want to do the exposure with. The medications that are typically used are medications normally used, or at least often referred to as antidepressants. Specifically, they're SSRI, stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, they're called antidepressants simply because that's the first thing they were used for. But in fact, SSRIs work with a variety of disorders, including panic disorder. I want to make a quick note. We used to use anti-anxiety drugs for panic disorder, but there were two problems with it. You needed massive quantities, and the quantities were such that it was very hard to think clearly when you had the dosage level that you needed. The second is that we had terrible rebound effects when you came off of the drug. So often the panic came back with a vengeance. The key element is exposure. This is key for all anxiety disorders. Remember this theme. We are programmed to learn anxiety quickly, but to unlearn it slowly. We learn it quickly because, well, that has great survival value. Those who didn't learn to be anxious about dangerous situations quickly probably died young, didn't pass their genes on, so those genes got lost. Those who did learn to become anxious in the face of danger were more likely to survive and reproduce. But we can unlearn anxiety. It just takes time, and we do it with gradual exposure until the situation that created the anxiety no longer does. That process is called habituation.